Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Where Are Mid-Market Companies Investing? Executive Insights on Capital Spending and Technology Trends in the Middle Market. This webinar is presented to you by ACG PERT in partnership with VistaVu and NCMM. We want to let you know you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar to ask questions. The questions will be monitored and the presenters will answer as many as possible, either during or after today's presentation. And we also want to let you know the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on ACG's website along with the slides from today's presentation. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Now, let's meet our panelists. First up is Doug Farren. He is the Managing Director at the National Center for the Middle Market. His purpose for founding the country's first center of its kind is to provide data, analysis, insights, and perspectives for companies, policymakers, and other key stakeholders to accelerate growth and increase competitiveness. Tim Singleton has over 30 years of experience supporting ERP and WMS software in the distribution industry. His former company, VistaVu Solutions, was recently acquired by VistaVu, and he's now the Vice President of VistaVu's Business One practice, where he provides guidance on the harmonization of products and technology innovation, such as IoT, cloud, mobile, and machine learning. Finally, Jory Lamb holds an MBA from Wharton and is the CEO and founder of VistaVu Solutions, where he leads the company's vision and strategy. Over the last 25 years, VistaVu has become one of the largest SAP mid-market partners across North America, having been recognized by many industry awards, including Inc. 5000, Profit 500, and the Better Business Bureau. So thank you to all of our panelists. Now let's hand it over to Doug for his presentation.
Thanks, Kara. It's a pleasure being here today, and also great to be back with ACG. The National Center for the Middle Market has had a long-standing relationship with ACG Global. Have done a number of events across the years, and glad to also bring VistaVu in. VistaVu was a supporter of our last middle market indicator, so it's nice to connect all those dots here today. I'm going to be presenting some of the highlights from our Q2 middle market indicator survey. This report was released at the end of July, so the data and insights are all still relatively fresh. And then from there, I think we're going to go into a discussion, including both Tim and Jory. So again, if you're not familiar with the National Center for the Middle Market, we are located at The Ohio State University Fisher College of Business. We're a partnership with Chubb, and I'm happy to kind of preview an announcement coming soon that Visa will also be joining us as a sponsor. But really, as Kara said, what we do is conduct research, outreach and engagement, and education all around the middle market. And therefore, we share a very similar interest with ACG and many of its members. Again, as more of background, just to remind everyone the way that we define the middle market, we have, in our 10 years of existence, used a revenue-based definition of $10 million to $1 billion. Of course, within that, we do sub-segment to lower core and upper middle market. It's about 200,000 companies across the US, representing a third of private sector employment and GDP. So very, very important to our economy, and it's really what spurred the formation of the NCMM. So today, again, I'm going to be sharing highlights of primarily the MMI, but also some of the pandemic-related research. So we've been doing pulse checks on middle market companies since March of 2020. Fingers crossed that this will be the last one that I'm reporting on. At least that was the goal in June when we fielded the survey. We may have to revisit that, but I'm going to weave in just a couple of those insights as well. But primarily, we're going to be focusing on middle market performance, as well as looking at areas in terms of technology and digital transformation. So kind of what's going on with the middle market. So these are those four time periods that I mentioned. Of course, at the beginning of all of this, almost 18 months ago, lots of uncertainty, unprecedented times. The floor had literally dropped out from a lot of businesses across the country. So things like, how do we maintain our operations? How do we maintain our customer and employee relationships and communication? All those things have drastically continued to drop in terms of concerns. The one thing that maybe is still a little bit on the minds of these middle market executives, and again, we surveyed 1,000 of them all across the US, is how do they maintain their employee communications? And that's just another area where technology is playing a role. If you've seen any of our prior presentations, you're probably familiar with this dashboard. It's really the kind of key summary of middle market performance. On the left, you can see last 12 months revenue growth at 8%. The next 12 months projected at almost 10% revenue growth. So extremely aggressive and high projections. And then employment growth, similarly, almost 6% in the prior 12 months and projected at 9%. Of course, with everything that you've probably seen and read about labor shortages and availability, it'll be really interesting to see if the middle market can actually meet that employment projection. Throughout the history of the MMI, which is now in its 35th edition, we've always seen that projection be a little bit conservative. In other words, 12 months after that's made, we've always seen the numbers come in higher. But given the challenges that exist out there in the workplace, it'll be interesting to see. I do want to add, for private equity-backed companies, which would certainly interest this audience, the revenue growth was 10.1% and projected to be 13%. And employment growth was 9.2% and projected to be 12.4%. So you can see the PE-backed companies are actually well outperforming the average and the balance of the middle market. Next, we move to capital investment. About 58% of the companies saying that they are looking to invest back into their business. This has been increasing over the last couple of surveys, but has yet to return to kind of its historical average of about 2/3, 66 to 68%. And then finally, on the right, we do measure confidence in various levels of the economy, global, national, and local. And it's interesting to point out these numbers are at an all-time high. So again, going back to Q1 of 2012, when we launched the MMI, we have never seen confidence levels this high across any of those three dimensions. Again, here's just some of the trending data on revenue. Obviously, we had the two surveys where we saw declines in revenue, all pandemic related, but you can see the bounce back to 8% revenue growth and the projection at almost 10. Now, I do want to point out, though, this recovery, so to speak, isn't universal. So I want to point you to that far right column. So this is the data for Q2. Again, this survey was fielded in June, 1,000 companies. But what we see is about 45% of the companies actually saying that their revenue grew 10% or more. So very, very strong performance, doing really well, kind of bouncing back from any pandemic related shocks. However, at the bottom, at the other end of the spectrum, 34% of the companies saying their revenues are either still flat or continuing to decline. So what you see is kind of this split recovery. It's not universal. You've got a group doing well, you've got a group still struggling. Next, we look at expansionary activity. So as you can see, over the course of time, we look at a couple different categories, including new products and services, adding new plant or facilities to the business, taking on new debt. A lot of these have continued to decline, especially since 2019. The one that is increasing is looking at expanding into new markets. So that's something to keep an eye on as middle market companies look at areas that they can continue to grow. Here's the employment trend as well. Again, we're getting back to that average employment growth rate of around 4.5%. This survey is closer to 6% with a projection at 9%. But again, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this plays out, particularly as we go into the field with our next survey, which will be coming up in December, to see how those labor challenges. And again, it's not just in hospitality, bars, restaurants. We're starting to see it in areas of the supply chain, transportation, logistics, manufacturing, which has historically had kind of a skills challenge as well. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I mentioned the kind of the record high confidence levels, but you can see going back to when we launched this survey instrument back in 2012, things have kind of progressively trended up. And then around 2017 started to stabilize quite well. And then of course, two quarters or two surveys of dips, followed by this kind of record high increase in confidence across different levels. That investment trend, kind of similar. Again, I mentioned the historic average has been about 2/3 of the companies saying that they would, take additional capital and invest it back in their business. So it's nice to see that this number is slowly ticking up, although it's lagging some of that reported confidence as well as revenue performance. So we're going to keep an eye on this one as it goes forward as well. Where are they investing that money? So this kind of follows up on, okay, what would be the likely destinations of your capital investment? You can see 25% of the companies saying they would put it back into plant or equipment, followed by 18% saying that they would focus on information technology. That makes a lot of sense given all the remote work, the shift to, maybe having part of your workforce working remotely, having to access files and information. You want to make sure that you've got the right cybersecurity platforms and things of that nature, more personnel, training and development, so on and so forth. But that's kind of where the middle market is targeting their investment. So now what, as we look out, again, these are kind of a look at some of the long-term challenges. You can see just tremendous drops from 18 months ago in terms of projecting out revenue or growth initiatives or demand. The one area I do want to call out, though, is supply chain. This continues to weigh pretty heavily on the minds of middle market leaders, and they're worried about a couple different things. One is the availability of raw materials. Even as a consumer, we're starting to see this now where I know just personally going into a Costco this week, there's no toilet paper, there's no paper towels. So we're starting to see, the same type of materials shortages. Also increasing costs. So middle market companies are concerned about the costs that they're incurring throughout their supply chain, and obviously going to be facing choices about whether to pass that on to their customers or do they eat that at the expense of their profit margins. And finally, the reliability of their suppliers, given that a lot of middle market companies also work with other middle market companies within their own supply chain. So again, something for us to keep our eye on. Another thing during the pandemic that we've been closely monitoring is the impact on various business activities. So you can see a bunch of activities there around the left, a lot of data here, but essentially what we're doing is we're taking the net of positive impacts and negative impacts. There's two that I want to call out here. Supply chain, which I just talked about, has the lowest net there. So lots of negative impacts across supply chain. But if you look at the bottom, digital transformation throughout the entire time that we've been monitoring during the pandemic has had a positive impact. So at this stage, it's the highest, net of 37. In other words, middle market companies are telling us, yes, this whole situation that we've just gone through, and hopefully are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but that has actually accelerated a lot of the things we were thinking about in terms of our own digital transformation. So what are companies doing? Where do they stand in terms of their own digital transformation journey? Well, you can see here about half of the companies are saying that they're pretty far down the road. They're actually using different platforms, different tools and technology to actually optimize value for their company, for their customers and their stakeholders. Another 25% or so are really just getting into, kind of that, what I would call the foundational stage of, converting to processes that are no longer paper, digitizing formats, things of that nature. And then finally, we've got kind of the highest end, which is 21% of the companies saying that they are actually at the point where they feel like they're achieving enterprise-wide automation, that they are doing things in a transformative nature that they couldn't have done before had they not invested in these different types of tools. So the primary goals, a lot of middle market companies tell us, and it should come as no surprise, but the investment in these types of tools are really focused on cost and agility. But these are the destinations. So we ask, what are you looking to actually invest in? You can see operations being the number one area, about 46% of the companies saying that they're looking at tools and platforms that'll help digitize operations, followed pretty closely by central management solutions that would include things like ERP systems, customer relationship management systems, accounting and software that kind of, again, brings a little bit more sophistication to the management of the business. And then you can see some other things there too around intelligence and systems integration. Finally, we were just very curious, given all the things that have happened, kind of how companies were thinking about changes that they've made that will be permanent versus those that may be temporary. So you can see here some of the top areas that were cited by the companies that we surveyed. Number one being a permanent increase on cyber and data security. As I mentioned earlier, having your workforce remote kind of really necessitates this focus. So a third of the companies said they've already do it, another 10% saying they're going to do it soon. Next would be customer engagement activities. So I mentioned that concern around disconnect with customers, being that a lot of us can't be face-to-face, visiting, customer sites, going to trade shows. So that seems to be more of a permanent change. Video conferencing platforms, engagement activities, and so forth. So in summary, kind of where that leaves us, yes, the middle market is on a path to recovery. We saw some robust numbers, as I showed a little bit earlier in the presentation, after 2 consecutive surveys where we showed declines. So that tells us that the recovery is well underway and confidence for the future is high. I will note, though, that since this was collected in June, I think that was kind of, where we saw the light at the end of the tunnel. So things have changed, obviously, in the environment the last couple months. Not quite sure yet if we're going to, see the end of pandemic-related impacts in the very near future. Certainly, that's the hope. But it'll be interesting to see, again, come December when we feel this again. And then finally, this recovery has not been universal. We've got the kind of high-flying growth leaders, as we call them, but at this group that's struggling. Supply chain and challenges around customer engagement continue to weigh on the minds of middle market lenders. And it's really going to be digital transformation, as I kind of summarized in the last couple of slides, that is going to fuel how companies think about how they should continue to grow, perhaps change their operating model, become more cost-effective, more efficient, and more responsive to their customers. So with that, I think I'm going to open it back up to our 2 other guests, Tim and Jory.
All right, Doug, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really informative, a lot of great insight there. And if we've got Jory and Tim back now, I see you there both. Thank you so much for coming back in. Let's go into our discussion now. And I'm going to start with you, Tim. Before I do, I just want to let everybody know, for the audience, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar there. So if you want to put your questions in there, and we'll get to as many as we can after we have our discussion. But Tim, let me start with you. Are you seeing any interesting trends within your lower mid-market customers, giving the increased M&A confidence in smaller deals?
Yeah, I guess over the past 12 months, we've definitely seen an increase in M&A activity in the mid-market and small to mid-market that we serve. The pandemic definitely has exposed the weakness in many of these organizations, their operations, their overall business model. And a lot of these companies are reassessing their businesses. We're seeing a lot of direct investments in technologies. As Doug mentioned, a lot of the customers and companies are investing in technologies such as e-commerce, mobile, cloud, logistics, automating their logistics a lot more than they had in the past. And others are using the abundance of available capital right now to acquire those capabilities, whether it be a competitor, that they're acquiring a better infrastructure or additional skills and personnel, especially with the labor market the way it is. And finally, we see quite a few legacy companies who don't have the technologies and the infrastructure in place really looking at the market and the higher multipliers and using it as an opportunity to be acquired or merge with a larger competitor.
Jory, as a software solutions provider, how have you helped PE-funded organizations really integrate and grow?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. First of all, let me just say it's absolutely our pleasure to be in front of ACG and its membership today, and happy to partner with NCMM on this great work. For us, a lot of our customers are one of three in the mid-market. They're either PE, private equity funded, publicly traded, or subsidiary of large enterprise. And so there's a level of growth and scale that they all are looking for. And what we've seen when we work with these PE firms is the opportunity to bind the digital core, which is the ERP system, with a lot of the tool set that aids in the day-to-day operations of these businesses. If I could, I'll give you a specific example and to kind of illustrate the point. So one of our PE funded customers is a company called SEF, funded by a large PE firm, Argonaut Capital, out of Oklahoma. They first came to us with the need to get a single ERP system, as they were the machination of about 3 or 4 different legal entities, all using their own system. And so in order to scale, they needed consistency in processes. But the real value we brought, I think, happened later on when we started working with them operationally on embedding IoT sensors into their manufactured equipment. And what they did with those sensors is tracked, obviously, the day-to-day or the minute-to-minute, second-to-second events around their equipment, which allowed them to reduce the number of people on site, improving safety, reduce the amount of rekeying. Fast forward to just a week ago, because they embedded IoT and because it's part of the whole ecosystem, they accomplished a record that had never been done in their industry. They continuously pumped through their equipment for 24 hours straight, actually 35 hours straight. And what that means to the PE firm that is funding them is everyone else stood up and took notice. This technology enabled them to do something no one else had done before in the industry. And I have it on good word that there's now tremendous interest from various strategic companies out there in what they've done to take a serious look at them and see what opportunities might lie.
Well, then maybe my next question, perhaps piggybacks off that for Doug's, which is why have PE firms traditionally outperformed others in the middle market?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've noticed, over time. Jory kind of pointed out in some of those specific examples, some of the reasons, but I would say, a couple of things. So obviously PE firms bring capital to the table, but the other thing that they usually contribute to these middle market companies is management expertise and then sophistication, or basically, using some of those examples that Jory just gave, how do you elevate the internal operations and efficiencies of these companies? What middle market companies have traditionally done well, they've got great leadership, great culture, whatever it is, product or service that they do it very well. But inevitably, most of them will typically reach kind of a growth wall where they no longer have the internal resources or knowledge to kind of overcome some of those growth challenges. So, especially in the middle market, where a lot of the PE firms tend to have, a certain set of industry focus or, have very solid expertise, they're able to bring that into their portfolio companies and really elevate, everything from the sophistication, as I mentioned, to the overall performance, to the quality of the talent. Everything just seems to elevate when there's that partnership.
Well, and speaking of current challenges, Tim, let me ask you, do you have any examples of how maybe your customers have successfully adapted to the current environment?
Yeah, we have a mid-size ice manufacturer and distributor, and they had implemented our solution for initially ERP right before the pandemic. And this is a company that's selling your standard ice, blocks of ice, cube ice, dry ice, to restaurants, hotels, airlines, and hospitals. So 3 out of 4 of their industries that they serve were hit hard during the pandemic. Delivering to the hospitals was a challenge logistically and coordinating with the hospitals. And really what they have done over the past 18 months is really made the decision to integrate and really automate all aspects of their business, from the production of the ice, but really going out further. So e-commerce and things like that to make it more easy for customers for self-service, but using technologies like APIs. They have now live feeds of the temperature of the trucks to make sure that it's at a proper temperature gauge and it's not going below a certain temperature, which is reducing their write-offs. But they've embraced APIs, so we can get vehicle routing and notification to the customers of an upcoming delivery. So to the hospitals, this is very important to coordinate things logistically, and they're doing it for routing and automatic delivery notifications all the way through. So they've looked at this time as an opportunity to embrace new technologies, everything from digital signatures when they're doing it. But as everyone gets from Amazon, they'll take a picture of the items when they do the delivery. So I was a little surprised in Doug's numbers that a lot of supply chain companies are not embracing integrations. I think that was one of the lower levels as far as percentages. And from my perspective, I think it's one of the more important areas, definitely within the supply chain right now, that's needed.
Tim, you may have just touched on this, but I'll ask Doug, and this might have to do with, embracing that technology like you just were talking about. But Doug, how are these middle market companies really dealing with very rapidly changing conditions now across the country?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And, we've talked to CEOs and owners across a variety of industries over the last 18 months. And, one of the beauties, I think, and maybe one of the underappreciated aspects in general of the middle market is their ability to be nimble. When I worked in a Fortune 500 company, making big strategic shifts was often compared to kind of steering the Titanic. It took a lot of effort, took a lot of time. You've got to, rally a lot of people around that. In the middle market, it seems to be a pretty, sweet spot where they can certainly, nobody was immune from what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, but a lot of them have been able to pretty quickly adapt. There's an example of a great company we interviewed in Philadelphia called PDC Machines. They make basically like gas cylinders for the clean energy industry. Family-owned business, second generation. A lot of their customers were based in Asia. And so traditionally, the company executives had spent, 75% of their time traveling and visiting customer sites and talking to them about machinery and things like that. Well, when travel was essentially halted, instead of just throwing their hands up and saying, well, I guess we won't be able to connect with our customers, PDC actually went out and they bought a couple of drones. They hired a video production company. They were able to do live demonstrations as, custom built machinery was going through their plant. So customers could log in and actually see their product being built. Their engineers could connect and ask questions real time. They also then started to produce a number of videos that they could use for demos and live, webinars and things like that. So just I think a very creative way that lower end middle market manufacturer kind of adapted to those conditions. And we've heard lots of that as well. So I just think in general, when we've seen challenges, whether it be, workforce related, the pandemic, middle market companies just tend to be able to be pretty resilient and they kind of figure things out.
Jory, are there any key trends maybe that you've seen perhaps over the last 5 years or so with mid-market customers?
Yeah, so we've been doing this a long time. We've been, VistaVu's been around 25 years and been offering ERP for about 18. In the early days, in the mid-market, just offering ERP was quite new and novel. Well, fast forward to the last 5 years or even to today, ERP is pretty prevalent. We see that over 50% of those who responded have something. What is trending and what is being adopted is areas like cloud. Tim alluded to that earlier, the fact that a lot of the earlier iterations of ERP were legacy client server, license maintenance type business models. That's all shifting and has been accelerated in its shift through COVID. We're certainly seeing a greater interest on intelligent enterprise. This is a term that SAP uses, but I think it's really the idea of the next step past your digital transformation. So once you've embraced the idea of ERP to drive operational efficiencies or gain some of that value, it's now about looking more holistically to see how can the systems enable the company. So in real time, grabbing that data and having decisions made through the systems. And so my previous example of using IoT, that system, that single fully integrated system has enabled them in real time to know if there's a problem and more importantly, to self-correct if there is a problem. So we see that trend on the horizon, this idea of an intelligent enterprise. And then I think the third one that we're seeing as well is an increased focus on bundling and looking to service providers, publishers to bring very, very granular industry solutions to them. Early days of ERP, early days of systems were fairly generic, and they were applied universally across multiple industries. Today, today, if I am a window and door manufacturer, I am looking for a solution specific to a window and door manufacturer. So I think, again, for us, what we've observed is those trends. And as a service provider, we've been making the investments to make sure that we're in lockstep with the movement of the market.
And Tim, as we talk, Jory speaks about, investments. What about these smaller mid-market companies? Tim, what would you say are the top investment areas for organizations that perhaps have some limited resources?
Sure. And it's definitely going to vary, customer by customer and industry by industry. But I think the two primary areas are going to be investments around improving operational efficiencies and obviously improving customer service at the same time. I do go back to, especially if it's limited resources and you want to get a lot of bang for the buck, is understanding and embracing APIs and integrations, because having the integration to other technologies is a definite good investment if you have limited resources. So as I mentioned with the ICE manufacturer, they're not going to develop sensors and vehicle routing systems themselves, but through the APIs, we're able to integrate to Google Maps and sensors and other technologies that they don't have to make the investments in the R&D in those areas. So I would make this suggestion and hopefully kind of expands out into APIs. The other area around operational efficiencies is within the warehouse and the logistics. And for the small to mid-sized organizations, it's surprising still how many pick and pack and do their transactions on a piece of paper that's been printed out, and how they notify their customers and how they're notified of their inbound products and outbound products. That is really something that the small and mid-sized distributors and companies in the supply chain need to better embrace, even with the limited resources that they may have, because it's becoming more necessary to improve the supply chain.
So then I guess that goes with, and Doug, I'll go back to you now, really like where to begin. So what areas of the organization are most likely candidates for investments in that kind of technology and maybe starting the journey towards digital transformation?
Yeah, some of the things that Tim mentioned are exactly what we've been recommending. So the center released some content about 2 years ago with a framework on how mid-sized companies can think about digital transformation for their own business. It included different buckets like what you actually sell, what's your product and service, how you make it, how you sell it, your IT backbone, and so forth. So really the three that I would think about, as Tim said, how companies produce their product, their operations, their production, their supply chain, all those things critically important. One of the classes I teach at Fisher College of Business, in addition to middle market, is in retail. And every guest speaker I've had in so far this fall have all said supply chain, like it's going to become so critical, not only to that industry, but I think a lot of other industries, who may not have given it its proper due. So that'll be certainly one. Another one would be in these areas, like I said, around customer experience, around sales and marketing channels. A lot of middle market companies are B2B. You've obviously got some, consumer brands as well, but given the fact that they're B2B, what can they be doing differently, and how can these tools help them along that way? And then I think the third place to think about would be their people. As we talk about workforce, middle market for 5 or 6 years has been telling us that it's been a struggle to attract the right people and retain the right people for their organizations. Now you add on this complexity of, okay, do they have the right digital skills? Do we've got people who are, really the right fit for the types of things that company wants to do to help transform their business? And I think that becomes another area that deserves a lot of focus.
So Jory, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, maybe some other key technology areas that you think that have proven most beneficial for the mid-market companies?
Yeah, sure. Before I before I go there to talk about other technologies, if I could just add to what Tim and Doug have been speaking to.
Sure.
This is a very comprehensive survey that Doug and his team have put together. The primary research on this is fantastic. And so one area that, again, time just doesn't allow to go through all of it, but that we saw in the results is key drivers as to when or why these mid-market firms were making investments in technology. And the number one reason that we pulled out of the data was control around the business, controls to ensure that as they grew, that the business didn't grow beyond them or out of control. And so that was a key driver. The other one, and Doug spoke to it, was customer experience. A lot of these mid-market owners, leaders really see the technology playing a pivotal role in the overall customer experience. And so with that understanding, I think what I would say, some of the technologies that are out there, there's many that are being adopted rapidly. So Tim spoke to, the area of e-commerce. You think about, anything to do with communications, whether it's internal or external. Zoom is our best example of that in the industry as to their growth curve. Ones that I'm being exposed to, integration. There's a technology grouping called iPaaS, Integration Platform as a Service, but just connecting all these pieces. And I think the time has come where a lot of these business leaders and owners are just done with all these siloed systems. And so now, as the business units like sales, marketing, take more ownership of the technology that will support them, they're going and buying these pieces and coming back to IT and saying, make it work. Make it talk to each other. We don't want to have 5 different areas in a company where we have to update the customer's information or the employee's information. And I think another and final one that I see a lot is analytics. And if we talk about controls, certainly analytics is part of that, whether it's alerts, approvals, budgeting, authorizations, analytics. People need to get their arms around the business because the earth is shifting below them.
Yeah, really. And Tim, I see you nodding your head with some of that. Did you want to jump in? Do you have a point you'd like to make? related to that?
Agreeing with Jory, the analytics piece, and when you talk about, just technologies in general, my thought is it's more integration in the supply chain is needed, which I've mentioned more than I should have. But embracing some of these new technologies, such as IoT and in sensors, so we can track where the inventory is. And even if they are on one of, many dozen ships off the coast of California, where those products are, so you can communicate that to your customer with sensors. But analytics in helping the supply chain and manufacturers is needed, so we can provide trends and we can make decisions on how to replenish and when to replenish. And it just needs to be tied together, and it needs to be sped up a bit more in the entire supply chain. The information needs to be connected faster so that people can make the decisions to buy a bit earlier than they are. That's kind of, I think, an added challenge or an added component to the challenges right now going on in the supply chain.
Yeah, Kara, can I just add one more thing then?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
All these, these are all great points that I think are coming up. We should also recognize, though, that going through digital transformation isn't without its barriers, and that's something that we ask too. What are these companies seeing as challenges that are blocking them from doing this? Number one was costs. They look out at some of these systems or things that they've read about or heard about at bigger companies, and they think, well, gee, maybe, we probably can't afford to put in these different systems. So what that means is that's an opportunity for them to explore and figure out what's the best fit for them, because I know a lot of these are starting to be scaled appropriately for the middle market. Second, they say is the time. It's not just flicking a light switch, right, and then having everything at your disposal. One of the, I think the challenges in the middle market, we often say that, middle market leaders often are better at working in their business than on their business, meaning, a lot of them just don't take the time to step back and think more strategically and long term. So that could be also a detriment to thinking long term about how to best invest in these. And then third is then having, back to people, it's having the internal resources then to manage all these things effectively. So that's where leaning on, the right partners, the VistaVus and people like that can be really helpful in making sure that you're educated and have the right internal capability to make these investments as valuable as possible.
All right. Well, thank you for adding that, and thank the three of you. I do want to make sure we have enough time for some audience Q&A, because we are getting quite a few questions right now. So let me tackle those. I'm going to start back here with you, Doug, and going back to your presentation. I know you had said that the data was collected in June. Is that correct?
Correct.
So we had somebody ask, with the latest political blunders and the inflation increases, are people feeling maybe different views about the short term?
My assumption, again, I don't have any data at my fingertips because, like I said, we won't be going back out to resurvey until shortly after Thanksgiving here, December timeframe. But yeah, I mean, certainly, these are snapshots in time where we were in June. As I mentioned, even with COVID, things appear to be much, much better. I think we thought we were kind of rounding the turn here on this whole pandemic, but just within a short 6 to 8 weeks, even as we were releasing the report just 6 weeks after we had collected the data, things were already starting to deteriorate. So yeah, all the news that's out there, I mean, certainly when you ask about confidence, that is a sentiment question. That's how people are feeling, and they take into account all the things they're seeing in the macroeconomic environment, things they're seeing on the news and reading in the paper and so forth. So yeah, I absolutely think that might have changed in the time we collected the data, but we'll certainly find out in the next round.
Well, and you may have another confidence question here.
Okay.
Given the economic confidence is so high, might we expect it to fall?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's related to the previous question that
Yep.
Whenever we see things, the Fed, whether it's talking about interest rates, because cost of capital has been basically zero for so long. Whenever you get threats like that or changes in the environment that might affect access to capital, we've talked at length about the workforce challenges that are going on right now. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that could contribute to a decay in some of that confidence. But, on the positive side, I think there's a lot of middle market leaders who are, they're seeing their pent up demand. They're eager to get back out there and kind of getting back into full growth mode. So we'll see if that can outweigh some of the confidence challenges.
And let me open this up to Jory and Tim as well. This next question, we've got kind of a lengthy one, so let's tackle it first. Can you discuss maybe some trends in personalized market content strategy? Is this something that you've seen mid-market companies start to utilize to help increase sales efficiency and effectiveness?
Okay, so I don't want to speak beyond my expertise. I would not want to say that it is or isn't on the rise. What I would say is that there is a very real shift in the sales motion that has occurred. So all of our customers who are selling any complex products and are unable or restricted in their ability to travel out to their customer, different countries, different regulations, they're having to find new ways to build that, especially on the net new side. Existing clients, it's a little easier to service them from a distance. On the net new side, it's extremely difficult to build trust and credibility over distance and, through a Zoom meeting or otherwise. And so the physical tools that people are starting to use, I can't speak to, but what I can tell you is that a different research company, Gartner in this case, has certainly seen a change in the role of the account executive and the sales team in how they need to go at acquiring net new customers. And there is a degree of personalization that is necessary, but there's a movement away from hard charging direct sales to more of a guide in the sales process as customers through their own buyer's journey maneuver their way in and out of your company's content, back out into the greater internet, back into you. And so they're showing up, and this is just a general trend, very well informed with a great understanding of what they want and some understanding of how you can help. So how you get them, how you engage them, and how you retain them through the buyer's journey. I can't comment on the tools, but there's an absolute shift in the buyer's journey and in the sales motion.
We had a couple of questions specific to cybersecurity, and I know you were all talking a lot about using technology and things like that. So it seems like people have some questions about that and maybe how to protect themselves and data. So if any of you want to weigh in on that, specifically cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. We do have a data point from the survey. So one of our corporate partners is Chubb, large commercial insurance company. And of course, they have, a lot of interest around managing risk. And so one of the questions we had was around, various operational risks to middle market businesses that are extremely or very, very challenging. Insufficient cybersecurity was cited as the number one operational risk to the business. 40% of the companies felt like that was their number one operational risk in their business. So yeah, clearly it's been kind of top of mind, but I think like I said earlier, the last 18 months has really brought this to the table as a more serious issue that I think a lot more companies are starting to look at.
What about the possibility of maybe some more commentary on M&A activities? What kind of multiples on revenue, for example, are you seeing, and maybe trends related to M&A?
So I don't have any of the multiple data, but that's not something that we collect, but I do think something that would be interesting to share. So we asked a question, again, this is kind of pandemic related, but how likely are certain activities going to happen as a result of the pandemic? So for this quarter, 44% of the companies said that it was much more or somewhat more likely to restructure. Another 39% thought it was likely that there would be a transition in senior leadership. And then directly to answer this question, 36% thought it would be more likely that their company would make a transformative acquisition. And a third of the companies, 33%, thought it'd be would be more likely that they would sell their business. So definitely there's been kind of an increase in interest around this. Even prior to COVID, we had been seeing, and I'm sure most on this webinar would be familiar with, there's been kind of a bubble as well with family-owned businesses where kind of reaching a point where some baby boomers are at the point where if they don't have an exit plan or a next generation to kind of transfer the business to, that they might be looking to sell or possibly merge. So that's the latest data that we see. It seems that there seems to be increased interest around those M&A activities.
And we definitely had a couple of questions related to COVID. Certainly no surprise to anybody. But we have one about supply chain issues reflecting global economies. COVID, for example, has impacted developing countries much more severely than in the US. Would you shed some light on the impact of economies outside the US are having in the USMM?
What I can tell you is what our customers are telling us right now about supply chain fulfillment. And so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to speak to the economies of those who are fulfilling, but with COVID today, some of our key manufacturers are telling us, and they measure this through their supplier relationship management systems, they're telling us that their on-target delivery dates is less than 5%. So to give that perspective, before COVID, it was north of 70%. I order a good, the supplier have told me that I'm going to get it by the 15th. It shows up on or before the 15th, 70% effectiveness. Today, those countries which we're sourcing a lot of product from, right, in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, they have a less than 5% on target rate for delivery dates. So it is a massive problem right now. And Doug talked about his experience, at Costco, but this is universal supply chain. And for those of you with greater knowledge about this, I'm sure you could add more, but it is a massive problem right now around supplying the world's demands for goods. And I'm not sure today that our customers have a lot of confidence that it's going to get better soon. So they're getting very creative in the way that they're approaching demand forecasting and supplier relationship.
And we have another question related to COVID. With the COVID shot mandates, will middle markets be the great beneficiary from F500 attrition?
Well, we're weighing into some political topics now. I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak to that.
Yeah, that's kind of remains to be seen, right? I mean, the only thing I can relate to this would be, shortly after the financial crisis, 2007 to 2009. It's when we, as the center kind of opened a few years after that, but we could already see in the data we were collecting at that time, middle market companies actually added jobs during that crisis. They added something around the area of like 2 million jobs, and big companies, so over 1 billion, shed close to 3.7. So, not that it's an exact correlation to this situation that we're talking about now, but there's always the possibility, right, that people leaving large enterprises make their way down to other opportunities that exist at mid-market companies. And certainly, those companies would be the beneficiary of all that great talent coming down, but we really don't know.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a lot unknown when we start talking about COVID and things like that. So appreciate you trying to tackle that one. Doug, Tim, Jory, any of you want some last thoughts and takeaways here before we close out our webinar?
Oh, I just want to thank everyone for attending. Definitely, Doug, your information was outstanding, very, very informative. So thank you all very much.
Yes, Tim, thank you. And we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully we got to your question, got them answered. We do want to remind you and ask you to please complete the post-event survey. A big thank you to Doug, to Tim, to Jory. Thank you all for being here. And if any of you would like to learn more about ACG PERT, you can always visit us online at acgpert.org. So thank you all for being here.